A teacher stood at the front of the classroom, her voice sharp and commanding. "How many times do I have to tell you to pay attention?" she barked, glaring at the black boy sitting quietly at his desk. All eyes turned to him. As the room grew tense, the boy's hands gripped his pencil tightly, his head lowered as the teacher continued, her tone dripping with disdain. "You'll never get anywhere in life with that attitude. Lazy, inattentive, always making excuses." The words stung, not just for him but for anyone paying attention. Some students exchanged awkward glances, while others whispered or smirked, enjoying the spectacle. The boy finally raised his head and said calmly, "I'm calling my dad." The teacher scoffed. "Go ahead," she said with a smirk. "Let's see what he can do." Little did she know, his father's arrival would change everything and teach her a lesson she'd never forget. Where are you watching from today? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful and inspiring stories. The classroom buzzed with quiet chatter as students shuffled into their seats. Notebooks were opened, pencils scratched across paper, and backpacks rustled against the tiled floor. In the back corner, a black boy sat silently, adjusting his glasses and flipping through his textbook. He was always the first to arrive, his desk organized neatly, ready for the day. His posture was straight, his focus unwavering, but there was a quiet hesitance in his demeanor. He loved learning, especially math and science, where numbers and logic felt more reliable than the people around him. But in this predominantly white school, he often felt like an outsider. Subtle glances from his classmates and quiet whispers during group projects reminded him of the divide. He had learned to tune it out most of the time, carrying himself with quiet resilience. But some days were harder than others. "Settle down, everyone!" The teacher's sharp voice cut through the noise. She strode into the room, heels clicking against the floor, holding a clipboard that seemed more like a weapon than a tool. Her expression was stern, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for trouble. "Let's see who's ready to learn today," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Her gaze lingered on the boy in the back, narrowing slightly. The boy straightened in his seat, pretending not to notice her focus on him. He was used to it. She always seemed to find a reason to single him out. The teacher, known for her strictness, prided herself on maintaining control in the classroom. She was a firm believer in discipline, often calling out students she deemed disruptive or inattentive. To her, the boy in the back wasn't a quiet, intelligent student. He was a problem waiting to happen. She saw his occasional hesitations or late homework submissions as signs of laziness, not the result of deeper challenges he faced as one of the few black students in the school. "Let's start with last night's homework," she said, glancing down at her clipboard. "Who wants to explain question 3? Several hands shot up, but hers immediately went to the boy in the back. "You," she said, pointing at him. "Explain it." The boy hesitated, glancing at his notebook. He had done the work, but her tone always made him second-guess himself. Slowly, he stood up and began to explain the problem, his voice soft but steady. Before he could finish, she interrupted. "Louder! Speak with confidence, or no one will take you seriously," she snapped, her words laced with condescension. The room fell silent. The boy took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to continue. "Wrong," she said abruptly before he could finish. "Sit down. This is why you need to focus more." A few students exchanged awkward glances. One or two whispered and giggled. The boy sat down slowly, his face flushed with embarrassment. He didn't argue. He never did. The classroom itself was a reflection of the teacher's personality, neat, orderly, and rigid. Motivational posters lined the walls, displaying phrases like "hard work pays off" and "stay focused." But they felt hollow in the boy's experience. The atmosphere wasn't welcoming, especially for students like him, who were constantly reminded that they didn't quite fit in. The teacher continued with her lesson, ignoring the uncomfortable tension that lingered after her harsh words. To her, this was normal. She believed in tough love and thought she was helping by being strict. In reality, she was perpetuating biases that made it harder for the boy to feel seen or valued. At home, things were different. The boy's father was his biggest supporter. He was a strong, articulate man who valued fairness and respect above all else. He had taught his son to stand tall, even when others tried to knock him down. At home, things were different. The boy's father was his biggest supporter. He was a strong, articulate man who valued fairness and respect above all else. He had taught his son to stand tall, even when others tried to knock him down. That evening, the boy hesitated as he unpacked his backpack. His father noticed immediately. "What's on your mind?" he asked, setting down the book he had been reading. The boy shrugged, not wanting to cause trouble. "It's nothing, Dad," he said softly. His father gave him a knowing look. "It doesn't sound like nothing. Talk to me." After a moment of silence, the boy finally spoke. He told his father about how the teacher always seemed to single him out, how she made him feel small in front of his classmates. He didn't cry, but his voice wavered slightly as he described the humiliation he felt that day. His father listened carefully, his expression calm but serious. When the boy finished, his father placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't deserve to be treated like that," he said firmly. "We'll handle this." The boy nodded, feeling a small sense of relief. He trusted his father to make things right, but he couldn't help wondering how the situation would unfold. The next day, the boy walked into class with the same quiet determination as always, but this time he knew his father was coming. The teacher was already in the room, preparing for the lesson. She glanced at him as he entered, her expression as cold and judgmental as ever. "Don't forget, you still have detention this afternoon," she said, her tone devoid of sympathy. The boy simply nodded and took his seat. He didn't say a word, but inside he was counting down the minutes until his father arrived. The classroom filled with students, and the day progressed much like the one before. The teacher continued to find small ways to critique the boy, from his handwriting to the way he answered questions. The tension in the room was palpable, but no one dared to challenge her authority. As the final bell rang, the boy stayed in his seat, waiting for his father. The teacher noticed and frowned. "What are you still doing here?" she asked. "I called my dad," the boy said quietly, his voice steady. The teacher smirked. "Oh, did you now? Well, let's see what he has to say." She crossed her arms, standing tall as if ready for a fight. She had no idea who she was about to face. The classroom was filled with the faint hum of students packing up their things for the day. But one boy remained in his seat, his hands resting on his desk, calm but deliberate. The teacher noticed him lingering and frowned. "What are you still doing here?" she asked. Her tone sharp. "I called my dad," the boy said softly, meeting her gaze. The teacher smirked, her arms crossing over her clipboard. "Oh, did you now? Well, let's see what he can do," she said, the dismissive edge in her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. The bell rang, and as the other students filed out, the boy remained seated, his calm demeanor hiding the simmering frustration beneath. The teacher, ever confident in her authority, didn't realize this moment was about to mark the start of something she wouldn't forget. Earlier that day, during math class, the atmosphere had been thick with tension. The teacher stood at the front of the room, clipboard in hand, scanning her students with the stern expression she always wore. Her eyes lingered on the black boy in the back, her usual target for scrutiny. "Let's go over the homework," she announced, Who wants to explain question 3? A few hands shot up, but the teacher ignored them. Her gaze settled on the boy. You, she said, pointing at him. Explain it. The boy hesitated, glancing at his notebook. He'd completed the work, but the weight of her expectations made him second-guess himself. Slowly, he stood up and began speaking, his voice soft but steady. Question 3 is about dividing fractions, he began. You have to flip the second fraction and then multiply. Before he could finish, the teacher cut him off. Louder, she snapped, her tone laced with impatience. Speak up so everyone can hear you. He cleared his throat and tried again, raising his voice slightly, but her disapproving glare didn't waver. Wrong, she interrupted, her voice cutting through his explanation like a knife. That's not how you solve it. Sit down. The boy froze for a moment, his face flushing with embarrassment. Sit down, she repeated, her tone cold and final. He returned to his seat, his head lowered. The silence in the classroom was heavy, broken only by a few whispers and stifled laughter from his peers. The teacher turned back to the class, her voice rising as she continued. This is what happens when you don't pay attention, she said, looking directly at the boy. Some of you think you can just get by with no effort, but that kind of attitude won't get you anywhere in life. Her words stung, not just for the boy, but for the entire room. Some students exchanged uneasy glances, while others avoided looking at him altogether. A few smirked or whispered among themselves, enjoying the show. You're lazy, inattentive, and disruptive, she went on, her words cutting deeper with every sentence. And it's starting to affect the rest of the class. I won't tolerate it. The boy's hands clenched under the desk, his knuckles white as he fought to keep his composure. From now on, the teacher added, you'll stay after class for detention until I see some improvement. Maybe some extra time to reflect on your behavior will help. As the tension in the room grew, the boy finally spoke up, his voice quiet but steady. I did the homework, he said. The teacher scoffed. Did you? Because from where I'm standing, it doesn't look like you've put in any effort. The boy looked her in the eye. I'll call my father, he said calmly. The teacher raised an eyebrow, a smug smile spreading across her face. Oh, you will? She said mockingly. Go ahead. Let's see what he can do. Without another word, the boy reached into his backpack, pulled out his phone, and dialed the number. The room fell silent as he spoke. Dad, he said, his voice steady, can you come to the school? There's a problem. The teacher watched, her confidence unwavering, as if she believed nothing could challenge her authority. She crossed her arms, her smirk still visible. Fine, she said, turning away. We'll settle this when he gets here. The boy ended the call, his face calm but determined. The tension in the room was palpable as the other students sat in silence, unsure of what to say or do. As the final bell rang and the classroom emptied, the boy remained in his seat, waiting. His father was on his way, and the teacher had no idea what was about to happen next. The classroom was empty except for the boy, sitting quietly at his desk, and the teacher, who stood near the front, her arms crossed in an expression of defiance. The silence was tense, almost suffocating, as the boy waited patiently. Moments later, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. The teacher glanced toward the door just as a tall, composed man entered the room. His presence was calm, yet commanding, and his eyes immediately found his son, who straightened in his seat. Dad, the boy said softly, relief evident in his voice. The father walked over and placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. He turned to the teacher, his expression polite but firm. I'd like to speak with you, he said, and I'd appreciate it if the principal joined us as well. The teacher's smirk faltered slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "Of course," she said, her voice tight. "I'm sure we can clear this up quickly." A few minutes later, the principal arrived and joined the father, the teacher, and the boy in the classroom. The principal, a middle-aged woman with an air of professionalism, looked between the three, sensing the tension in the room. The father remained calm as he began. "My son called me because he felt he was being treated unfairly in this classroom," he said, his tone measured. "I'd like to understand what happened." The teacher crossed her arms defensively. "I treat all my students equally," she said. "I don't single anyone out." The father raised an eyebrow, his voice calm but pointed. "Is that so? Because from what my son has told me, that doesn't seem to be the case." He gestured toward his son. "He told me that you called him lazy and inattentive in front of the entire class. Is that true?" The teacher hesitated, her confidence wavering. "I may have said something to that effect," she admitted, "but only because I want him to do better. It's called discipline." "Discipline," the father repeated, his tone sharpening slightly. "Discipline is meant to encourage growth, not humiliate. Calling a child lazy and inattentive in front of his peers does nothing but undermine his confidence." The principal looked at the teacher, her expression growing more serious. "Is this true?" she asked. The teacher shifted uncomfortably. I wasn't trying to humiliate him," she said defensively. "I was trying to set an example." The father's eyes narrowed slightly, but his tone remained composed. "Set an example?" "By singling him out and labeling him a bad influence in front of his classmates." He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but firm. "Let me tell you what kind of example that sets. It teaches my son that no matter how hard he works, he'll always be judged by assumptions rather than his actions." The boy sat quietly, watching his father with wide eyes. He had always known his father was strong, but seeing him speak so calmly, yet powerfully, filled him with a sense of pride and reassurance. The teacher, however, grew more defensive. "I don't have any biases," she said quickly. "I treat all my students the same." The father shook his head. "No, you don't," he said firmly, "and I can prove it." He pulled out a small notebook from his pocket and opened it. "Here's what my son told me. Last week, you called on him 3 times to answer questions he didn't volunteer for, but you skipped over other students who raised their hands. The week before, you dismissed his completed homework as sloppy, even though it was correct. And just yesterday, you criticized him in front of the class for asking a question, saying he should already know the answer." The principal's eyebrows shot up as she turned to the teacher. "Is this accurate?" The teacher stammered. I didn't mean for it to come across that way. I was just trying to push him to do better." "Pushing someone to do better means supporting them," the father replied, his voice growing firmer. "It doesn't mean tearing them down in front of their peers. It doesn't mean making them feel like they don't belong." The father took a step closer, his voice softening slightly but remaining powerful. "Do you know how harmful it is to assume the worst about a child? To treat them like they're less capable because of biases you may not even realize you have?" The teacher looked down, her face flushed with embarrassment. She didn't respond. The father continued. "It's not about discipline. It's about the assumptions you make that affect how you treat my son. Assumptions that can make a child lose confidence, lose interest in learning, or worse, believe that they'll never be good enough." The principal leaned forward, clearly moved by his words. "You're absolutely right," she said. "This isn't acceptable. We need to address this." The father nodded, then reached into his bag and pulled out a folder. "I want to show you something," he said. He opened the folder to reveal a series of documents. "These are studies on systemic bias in education," he explained. "They show how students of color, especially black boys, are disproportionately disciplined and labeled as disruptive or lazy, even when their behavior is no different from their peers." He handed one of the papers to the principal, who began reading it intently. "My son's experience is part of a larger issue," the father continued. "And I'm not just here as a concerned parent. I'm here as someone who fights for children like mine every day." The teacher looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" she asked, hesitantly. The father met her gaze. "I work with organizations that train educators to recognize and overcome their biases," he said. "I've seen firsthand how much of a difference it makes when teachers are willing to learn and grow." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Your approach needs to change," he said simply. "Not just for my son, but for every child who walks into this classroom." The room fell silent as the weight of his words settled over everyone. The boy sat quietly, his chest swelling with pride as he watched his father speak with such strength and clarity. For the first time, he felt truly seen and supported. The teacher's shoulders slumped, and she looked down at her desk. I didn't realize," she said softly. "I never meant to hurt anyone. I thought I was doing the right thing." The father nodded. "Intentions matter, but so do outcomes," he said. "Now that you understand the impact of your actions, you have the opportunity to make a change." The principal looked at the teacher, her expression firm but kind. "I think we need to have a serious conversation about implementing diversity and inclusion training for all staff," she said. The father smiled slightly. "I'd be happy to help," he said. The room was silent as the father stood in front of the classroom, his calm but commanding presence filling the space. The principal sat at one of the desks, flipping through the research papers he had handed her. The teacher, however, remained near the front, her defensive posture beginning to soften as the gravity of the discussion started to sink in. "You mentioned earlier that you didn't mean to hurt anyone," the father said, turning to the teacher. "But intentions alone aren't enough. What matters is the impact of your actions." The teacher nodded hesitantly, her confidence shaken. I didn't think I was treating him unfairly," she said quietly. "I thought I was being firm, the way I am with all my students." The father took a deep breath, his voice calm but resolute. "I understand that you thought you were doing the right thing, but the reality is that your words and actions have made my son feel singled out, judged, and humiliated. And he's not the only child who has experienced this." The teacher's eyes widened slightly, and she tilted her head. "What do you mean?" The father leaned against a desk, his tone softening, as he began to share something more personal. "You see, this isn't just about my son. This is about kids like him, and kids like me." He paused for a moment, letting his words hang in the air. The boy, sitting quietly at his desk, looked up at his father, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "When I was his age," the father continued, "I went to a school just like this one. I loved learning, but I didn't always feel like I belonged. My teachers, some of them, not all, made me feel like I wasn't capable, like I didn't have what it took to succeed. They didn't say it outright, but their actions told me everything I needed to know." The teacher's posture shifted, her arms slowly uncrossing as she listened. "They called me lazy when I struggled with a new concept," the father went on. "They told me I was disruptive when I asked questions. They assumed that any time I didn't do well, it was because I didn't care, not because I needed more support." He glanced at his son, his voice softening further. "I see the same struggles in my son today, and it breaks my heart to know that decades later, kids like him are still being treated the same way." The boy's eyes glistened with pride and understanding. He sat up straighter in his seat, hearing his father speak with such passion and clarity. The father turned back to the teacher. "But I didn't let those experiences define me," he said firmly. "I used them to fuel my determination to create change. That's why I became an education advocate." The teacher blinked, surprised. "An education advocate," she repeated. The father nodded. "Yes, I work with organizations that promote equality in schools. We train teachers to recognize their biases, both conscious and unconscious, and help them create classrooms where every student feels valued and supported." The principal looked up from the research papers, her expression thoughtful. "That's incredible," she said. "I didn't realize you were so deeply involved in this work." The father smiled slightly. "I've seen how much of a difference it can make when educators are willing to learn and grow," he said. "And I'm here today, not just as a father, but as someone who wants to help make this school a better place, for my son, and for every child who walks through these doors." The teacher's defensiveness began to fade completely. She shifted uncomfortably, her voice quieter now. "I never thought of myself as biased," she admitted. "But hearing you speak, I realize I may have let my assumptions influence how I treat certain students." The father nodded, his expression compassionate but firm. "Acknowledging that is an important first step," he said. "Bias isn't always intentional, but it's something we all need to confront and work on, especially as educators." The teacher looked down, her face flushed with a mixture of regret and reflection. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't mean to make your son feel the way I did. I see now that I've been unfair." The boy watched the exchange intently, his heart swelling with a mix of emotions. He had never expected his teacher to admit her mistake, and hearing her apology felt like a small but significant victory. The principal broke the silence. "This conversation has been eye-opening," she said, her tone decisive. "It's clear that we need to take action to address these issues, not just in this classroom, but across the entire school." The father nodded. "I'd be happy to help," he said. "I can lead workshops for teachers, focusing on diversity, inclusion, and the importance of equitable treatment for all students. It's not about pointing fingers. It's about giving educators the tools they need to do better." The teacher looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and remorse. "I'd like to attend those workshops," she said quietly. "I want to do better, for your son and for all my students." The father smiled warmly. "That's all I can ask for," he said. The principal stood, extending her hand to the father. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention and for offering your expertise," she said. "This is an opportunity for real change, and I'm committed to making it happen." The father shook her hand, his calm confidence radiating through the room. "Thank you for being open to this," he replied. The teacher approached the boy, her expression sincere. She crouched down to meet his eyes. "I'm sorry for how I treated you," she said softly. "You deserve to feel respected and supported in this classroom. I promise to do better." The boy nodded slowly, his voice quiet but steady. "Thank you," he said. As the meeting concluded, the boy and his father walked out of the classroom together. The boy glanced up at his father, admiration shining in his eyes. "You were amazing," he said. His father smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to let anyone make you feel small," he said. "You have a voice, and it matters. Don't ever forget that." The boy nodded, his confidence growing. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he belonged. The boy and his father walked out of the school building together, the boy's head held higher than it had been in weeks. His father's words from earlier echoed in his mind. You have a voice, and it matters. It was a moment he wouldn't forget, a moment that made him believe in himself again. Inside the school, change had already begun. The principal, deeply moved by the meeting, had made a commitment to addressing the issues brought to light. She started by implementing mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff, beginning with the teacher who had unfairly singled out the boy. The teacher sat at a desk in a small conference room, surrounded by her colleagues. A facilitator led the training, encouraging them to reflect on their own biases and how those biases could affect their students. The teacher listened intently, her mind replaying the conversation she'd had with the boy's father. At one point, the facilitator asked, "Think about a time when you might have judged a student unfairly. How did it affect their confidence or their ability to learn?" The teacher felt a lump in her throat. She thought about the boy, how he had stood at the front of the classroom trying to explain his homework while she interrupted him and dismissed his efforts. She thought about the way his classmates had stared, some whispering, others laughing. For the first time, she truly understood the weight of her actions. It wasn't just about a single moment in the classroom. It was about the long-term impact on a child's sense of self-worth and belonging. After the training session, the teacher sought out the boy. She found him in the hallway during lunch, quietly reading a book. She hesitated for a moment before approaching him. "Hi," she said softly, her voice different, gentler than he'd ever heard it before. The boy looked up, his expression cautious. "Hi," he said. The teacher crouched down slightly to meet his eyes. "I wanted to apologize," she said, "for the way I treated you. I see now that I was wrong, and I'm so sorry for making you feel like you didn't belong. You deserve to be respected and supported, and I promise to do better." The boy studied her for a moment, trying to determine if her words were sincere. Slowly, he nodded. "Thank you," he said quietly. Her heart felt a little lighter as she walked away. She knew she couldn't undo the past, but she was determined to make amends moving forward. The principal took additional steps to ensure no student would feel unfairly treated again. She announced new school-wide policies promoting inclusivity and fairness, including more robust anti-bias training for teachers and programs to celebrate diversity among students. Word of the father's involvement and the school's changes quickly spread through the community. Other parents, inspired by his courage and leadership, began sharing their own stories of challenges their children had faced. Teachers at other schools reached out to learn about the workshops he had offered to lead, eager to create more equitable environments for their students. The father's workshops became a catalyst for change, sparking conversations about equality and understanding within the education system. In the classroom, the boy began to notice small but meaningful changes. His teacher now called on him with encouragement rather than criticism. When he spoke, she listened with genuine interest. She even praised his work in front of the class, building his confidence bit by bit. His classmates, too, began to treat him differently. A few of them approached him during recess, offering quiet apologies for staying silent when the teacher had unfairly targeted him. "We should have said something," one of them admitted. "I'm sorry." The boy nodded, appreciating their honesty. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he belonged. His love for learning, which had been overshadowed by feelings of inadequacy, returned with new energy. At home, the boy's father watched him with pride. He noticed how his son now spoke with more confidence and approached his schoolwork with excitement rather than hesitation. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, the boy looked up and said, "Thanks for standing up for me, Dad." The father smiled, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "You're worth standing up for," he said, "and I hope you remember this. We can't change everyone's mind, but we can change their hearts by standing up for what's right." The boy nodded, his heart swelling with pride. He knew his father's words would stay with him forever. The ripple effect of that moment in the classroom continued to spread. The teacher, once dismissive of the boy, became one of his strongest advocates. The principal's policies created a more welcoming environment for all students, and the father's workshops inspired educators far beyond their school. In the end, it wasn't just about fixing one teacher's bias. It was about creating a culture of respect and understanding, one step at a time. As the boy and his father cleared the dinner table that evening, the father's words continued to echo in the boy's mind. We can't change everyone's mind, but we can change their hearts by standing up for what's right. That moment had not just changed the boy's life. It had sparked a chain reaction of understanding, growth, and equality within their school and community. The teacher's apology, the principal's new policies, and the father's workshops proved that real change starts with a single step. It reminded everyone that when you stand up for justice, you inspire others to do the same. It's not enough to recognize injustice. You have to act to create change. Now, we want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed or experienced bias? Share your story in the comments below. We want to hear from you and learn how you handled it. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more impactful and inspiring stories like this one. Your support helps us shine a light on important issues and inspire change in the world. Thank you for watching. Your story can inspire the world. See you in the next inspiring tale.